Hey everybody, this is Matt and we're at Texas Toast Guitars. Thanks for watching. Wanted to do a quick video today about some of the various ways that logs are milled into the lumber that you and I buy to make guitars. Okay, anyone who's read any manufacturer's literature probably has seen terms like flat-sawn or quarter-sawn and maybe even Riff-Sawn, and you might go, what in the hell does all that mean? So glad you asked. For the purposes of this conversation, I am in front of my mostly clean whiteboard, and I'm going to be drawing a couple of things here, so let's get right to it. One thing I want to point out before we go really any further, and that is, and this can become very clear as I go, but is which orientation the dimensions that I'm talking about are occurring on the lumber that I'm talking about for the purposes of this video. Here's what I mean. Everybody knows what a 2x4 looks like, right? So, and everybody knows that it's neither 2 nor 4. So imagine if the 2x4 end was a little bit like this. This is the 2 part, and this is the 4 part. And the length of the board goes off in this direction here. And it is, of course, not to scale. Okay. So we got the 2 part, this is going to be our height. We've got the 4 part, this is going to be our width, and then this length here is whatever it is, you know, 2x4 8, 2x4 10, 2x4 pre-cut stud, you get the idea. All right, so let's talk about a handful of ways that lumber is milled. For the purposes of this section, I'm going to be drawing the end grain of a tree here, and these will be you'll have to use your imagination, but these are the annular rings of the tree. Okay, so that's what it looks like from the end. Typically, most lumber that is milled in this country is Plane-Sawn, or sometimes it's referred to as flat-sawn. That is going to mean that our height and our width of said 2x4 will look a little bit like this. Now, let's blow that up a little bit. Here is our 2x4, and here are the annular rings. As you can see, the grain is perpendicular to the height, and it is parallel to the width. The board goes like this, let's say, and again, not to scale. So what are the advantages of something like that? Well, yield from the tree. Obviously, they don't just take a big chunk out of this and then throw everything else away. There are a handful of ways that this kind of lumber is derived. It is my understanding that most Plane-Sawn lumber is a chunk is taken off there, and that's a board. And then a chunk is taken off there, and that's a board. And a chunk is taken off there, and that's the board. And so on. And the log is kind of rotated around. Like that. Now, you will notice that each one of these boards, the grain is going in this orientation here. That is to say, perpendicular to the height and parallel with the width, except for this one hunk right in the center. That is what they would call Plane-Sawn. I'm going to draw another drawing. All right, so there's another way that you can arrive at that kind of plane sawing, but it's actually called live sawing. You don't see this a lot, except for people who have like home sawmills, is one of those things, because here's what that looks like. Here's our log again, and what happens is they just take and cut planks off the board with those like chainsaw, sawmill, bandsaw, sawmill things that you can buy, and it looks a little bit like that. But I want you to see something here. On the outer parts of the board, you get that grain pattern that we were talking about, where if you were to look here, if there was a board that was taken out of this chunk here, where the grain lines run perpendicular to the height and parallel to the width. Now, look what happens as you move down the log. If you were to take a section out of this middle chunk here, the grain orientation switches. And now it is moving parallel to the height of the lumber and perpendicular to the width, which is a whole lot like quarter-sawn. Quarter-sawn lumber is highly prized because of its stability. It is also, generally speaking, about double the cost of flat-sawn or plane-sawn lumber because the yield from each tree is less than ideal. Let's take a look at what a quarter-sawn log looks like. So quarter-sawn lumber is, as the name would imply, has something to do with 4 things. And what they do with a standard log here is they cut it into, you got it, quarters. Like so. Generally speaking, the yield is less because what they are looking for is the grain that runs vertically on the log. We're going to look at that again here in just a second. So how they generally do that is something like this. And as you can see, the grain is more or less, if we were looking at, let's say this is our 2x4 here, again, not to scale, the grain is running parallel to the height of the board and perpendicular or vertically to the width of the board. This is, generally speaking, how the ideal neck wood you want to have this when you're building a neck. But as you can see, a lot of this stuff kind of gets turned into hamster cage material. This right here, you guessed it. Finally, let's take a look at one other way that lumber is very infrequently found, and that's Riff-Sawn lumber. This has the least amount of yield per log than any of the 3 that we've talked about so far, but has one very cool advantage to the others that we'll get to here in just a second. But I want to show you what riff sawing actually looks like. By the way, if you've ever read a guitar making book where they talk about the differences between flat sawn and quarter sawn, you may have seen a diagram that looks like this. In fact, I have seen several of them. Riff sawing is taking, like quarter sawing, the idea is to take chunks out of the board like this. So as you can see, there is a ton of wasted material. And you're thinking to yourself, well, why the hell would anybody cut a log like this? What's the payoff? Well, the payoff for Riff-Sawn lumber is something called radial grain. What is radial grain? For the purposes of this conversation, it is going to be grain that does not run parallel or perpendicular to the height or width, but rather on the bias, diagonally. Something like that. Generally 30 to 45 degrees, I believe. Well, okay, why would anybody want that? Well, the reason you would want this would be for very specific furniture applications, like legs on a table or legs on a chair. If the grain is going diagonally, you will have nice straight grain. What I'm doing is I'm just extending these grain lines down my board here. So you'll have nice straight grain running the length of your board. Remember, here is our height and here is our width. So for those specific furniture making applications, it is worth it to those builders to spend the extra money on something that is radial like this. I have never actually seen that at any of the lumber yards that I have been to, unless it's just been a piece of quarter-sawn lumber that, or a piece of flat-sawn or plain-sawn lumber that just has, you know, diagonally oriented grain. And you have to dig through a lot to find that stuff. So let's take a couple looks at what just chunks of lumber look like that you are most likely to encounter. All right, here is our flat-sawn board. It is 2 inches tall by 4 inches wide, not to scale, and it's, you know, goes to infinity. The annular grain runs parallel parallel to the width, and it's got some cool things that it does. One is it's the least expensive piece of timber that you can buy, and of course it has some real beautiful elements to it too, something that I believe they call cathedraling, those in the know. What that means, everybody's seen this, is if you follow these grain lines, you start to get, you know, some of this kind of stuff. Cathedraling, that's kind of what the board looks like. And that's cool. So most Fender style bolt-on necks are made with flat sawn or plain sawn lumber, and it's perfectly fine. All right, so quarter sawn, we've got our 2-inch tall by 4-inch wide hunk of board, and our grain is running this way. And let's say the board is going off into infinity. And our grain lines are nice and vertical all the way down the face of the board. And that is the way the old school Fender necks used to be made. Now, there are probably some among you who are going, well, why don't they just use quarter sawn wood for table legs? Well, in a lot of cases they do. But because the grain is only going up and down, it's not going at an angle, you get that real cool straight grain on this side and this side. But on the opposite sides, you will get that cathedraling again. And I don't know, go ask a furniture maker. Okay guys, thanks for sticking with me on this topic so far. I'm sure that a lot of people have already shut their computers off and go, this guy's wrong. My dad told me it was some other way, or I looked on the internet and found this instead. There is a ton of misinformation on the internet about the way that lumber is sawn. Typically the guys who know the most about it are the people who do the most with lumber, and that's not guitar makers, it's probably flooring specialists and furniture makers. You've probably seen some other different ways to do it, you know, and the diagrams that I have drawn on here do not represent the way that every lumber mill cuts wood. Again, there's going to be that guy who goes, I worked in a lumber mill somewhere and I did it this way. Fine, you know what? You probably know a lot more than I do drawing on a whiteboard pictures of wood. So have a good time being right. But I urge you to look online and look at some of those experts and see what you can find out. Selecting a particular piece of lumber is really outside the scope of this video, but we are going to get to that. We're going to talk about why vertical grain lumber is cool to use, what runout is and why you should avoid it, and how you can achieve vertical grain lumber for your necks by using Plane-Sawn lumber. So if you have any questions about what we've talked about in this video, or if you'd like to tell me about what you'd like to see for future videos on topic like this, please leave them in the comment section below. If you'd like to tell me I'm full of shit, go ahead and leave that in the comment section below. I love getting those thought-provoking and helpful comments. So if you like the video, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed already, why don't you go ahead and do that now. This is Matt at Texas Toast Guitars reminding you that if you're so smart, build it yourself. That's what I do. Thanks for watching, everybody.